What is up, guys? The Strong Boys 19 here, and welcome to the second part of the dedication album review series for Slipknot's Joey Jordison. And for this collaborative review, I have with me for the first time in around more than a year with Mr. EQPTV. How's it going, mate?
Yeah, fantastic, man. I'm so pleased to be able to do this. As seeing as I'm not doing the YouTube thing anymore, to have an outlet and a person to speak to, converse about one of my favorite albums ever. It's unfortunate that the reasoning for this is so sad. Obviously, the passing of Joey Jordison, but yeah, really excited to do this one.
Right, so both of us are going to be doing the collaborative review on the very first official studio album, the self-titled debut record by Slipknot. Now, this album was released on June 29th, 1999, and it was recorded from September 98 to February 1999 inside Indigo Ranch Studios in California, produced by Ross Robinson. So this is where the world is going to hear Slipknot for the very first time in the band's history. But before we are going to jump right into the album itself, I'm going to tell you guys a bit of a background history in development before this album came to fruition. So after the release of the demo of Mate, Feed, Kill, Repeat, the lineup has been pretty much consistent, although Donnie Steele had decided to leave the band due to religious reasons. So he was then replaced by a guitarist named Josh Brainard, and he would remain as the next rhythm guitarist for Slipknot up until the connection with the guitar player that we get to know for the first time with Jim Root. So there's one gig at the Safari Club in August 97 with an unknown figure at the time in Slipknot's history of Corey Taylor. And that was when he did his very first debut performance with the band, with Anders Kolsefny still around backing Corey up. He was still doing lead vocals and percussion, but when Anders decides to quit and leave the band entirely, Corey was now at that point the band's main consistent lead vocalist. And this was at a time when the band were writing new material, and there were some songs that were written while Anders was still in the band, including tracks like Windows, May 17th, and Coleslaw. But when Corey came into fruition with the band as the main vocalist, they have been writing tracks including Heartache and a Pair of Scissors to Carve, and the band then decides to make their very first ever demo. Actually, I'm going to go back a bit. So after the departure of Anders, there were two different percussionists playing with the band. The first member was Greg Welts, and he did not stay very long with the band, and he actually had to be fired eventually because there was an argument between him and Joey Jordison's sister. And then Greg was replaced by a percussionist named Brandon Darner, who was actually the very, very first percussionist with Slipknot's history to have the very iconic lyre mask. So when Chris comes with the band, Brandon gave the lyre mask to Chris. So this is when the band go into the making of their first demo. They have made 5 tracks of early versions of Spit It Out, Wait and Bleed, and tracks of Snap, Interloper, and Despise. And when the demo was completed, the band's manager, Sophia John, decides to give a copy of the demo to the household producer of 90s metal, that is Ross Robinson, who would later on produce albums with Sepultura, and he also produced albums with Korn to Soulfly, etc. And the band wanted him to work for the production value for this album. This is where the recording process takes place. The whole aspect of making the album was very destructive and chaotic, according to the making of the album. And with the way the album sounds, it's a very live feel to it. Josh did also work on the rhythm guitar work with Mick Thompson, but before the album was set to be released, he decides to leave the band. Josh quits the band entirely, and that is when we get to be introduced to Jim Root. However, if you look at the album's cover art, Jim was not at the photo shoot, and that is Josh right there on the front cover wearing the black latex mask. So also this is signed by Mick Thompson, by the way. I don't want to really go into that, but the album cover is one of my favorite album covers of all time, and this would mark the only time that Josh ever appeared on a very iconic Slipknot album cover. So the entire thing was produced by Ross Robinson. The band was signed at first to I Am, but then eventually signed to Roadrunner Records. So at almost 60 minutes, the album's release, it received critical acclaim, and it went to #1 in the US, and then it became Roadrunner Records' best-selling album through that label, because the previous best-selling Roadrunner album was Machine Head's 1994 album of Burn My Eyes. But this album escalated to massive high charting sales. So what do you really think about Slipknot's self-titled album?
It's hard to know where to begin with an album like this. There's certain albums which they're almost so omnipresent, so popular, so era-defining that you wonder, like, what can one say about it that's not already been said? So things like Nevermind, Master of Puppets, Rain in Blood, Paranoid, Power Slave, British Steel, that sort of thing. They're albums which are almost so acclaimed, so popular, so important that it is very difficult to bring a new, sort of a fresh take to, I suppose. It's one of those albums for me that the more I learn about music, the more I appreciate. I feel like a lot of people they sort of dismiss Slipknot as sort of like a grungy, like, goth, fat goth kid metal band that you get into, and then you get into proper metal, and then Slipknot's just whatever. But I found precisely the opposite. Obviously, when I first heard it, which I'm sure we'll both go into our initial experiences of the album, it blew my mind. And then when I got more into death metal, extreme metal, industrial, and all the stuff that influenced this album, rather than looking back at this and going, oh, well, that's just sort of like the kiddie version, that's baby steps, that's my first metal album, Fisher-Price stuff, I actually look back and go, they were able to amalgamate all of these disparate, unconventional, underground influences and create an album that, as you said, became Roadrunner's best-selling album for a number of years. The popularity of it stretches across music genres. Slipknot, one of the most popular metal bands of all time now. And I think that is a testament to not just the quality of musicianship or the genius branding and that sort of thing, but the quality of songwriting, because that is really what makes these songs translate from, because they could be a mess. If you go, we're going to take bits of Swans and Morbid Angel and Throbbing Gristle and jungle music and Mr. Bungle and the Melvins and Neurosis, you imagine that in your head, you don't see how it can possibly work. But Slipknot, with the talent of the 9 men in the band, were able to craft these pieces of music which 22 years later haven't aged a day. So as I'm sure we'll get more into, it's one of my most treasured albums, full stop, really.
Yeah, so the first experience for me with Slipknot, The first ever album that I was listening to was around the era from Volume 3, The Subliminal Verses. But when I came into this album, this was mainly the album that really got me invested into the sound of the band. And there was nothing like this that I've ever heard in terms of the aggressiveness. And Slipknot were always the number one band that really got me hooked into getting into metal music, and as well as the band entirely. And as much as seeing the different music videos from the first three albums eras before All Hope Is Gone came out, I have admired how intense and I would say genre defining this album was. I mean, there were other new metal albums that were growing the genre up the map, including the Deftones' first couple of albums to Korn's self-titled. But this one, to me, is always my favorite in Slipknot's discography. And, every time I come back to this really has not been one of those that, in my opinion, has not aged well. I mean, for today's point of view, for some people, yet some people would be critical about some of the lyrics and some of the aggression and the heaviness that this sounds, because other people would decide and prefer much more heavier, technical, atmospheric stuff. But I think for a debut album, I believe that this was a game changer, and to shape up the popularity of what metal is going to become.
Absolutely. And similar to you, this wasn't my first Slipknot album either. I'm a couple of years younger than you, so my first Slipknot album was All Hope Is Gone. I got into them on that cycle. And looking back, that's actually my least favorite of their studio albums, funnily enough. And I didn't really get it at the time, because I saw it and I heard it and I went, oh wow, this band's pretty cool. And I like Sulfur, I like Psychosocial, I like Gematria, I'm not sure you say it. I was into the album, but one thing that I kept hearing is how frantic and crazy Slipknot were. And all these stories about them huffing dead crows and how crazy the stage shows were. And I'd watch videos of them live and I thought, and they look fantastic live in that era as well. But it was only when I went back and listened to the first album and suddenly everything that I'd ever been told about them, it all clicked. Seeing the Spit It Out video with all the Shining references and Wait and Bleed with that live performance and the Surfacing video and all that stuff. And suddenly I just went, I see now. I see why they've got this reputation as a crazy, frantic metal institution. And much like you, this is... I've sometimes flip-flopped between this and Iowa, but for a long time now, I've considered this my favorite. And you're talking about the atmosphere and how people might want something a bit more atmospheric than Slipknot. As I said earlier, they might see it as a bit sort of simple and brutish. But going back to it for this, every time I'm amazed at how, particularly in the second half or from Tattered and Torn onwards, how atmospheric it sounds. And one thing that Slipknot always got right was how they could act on the zeitgeist of horror in that time. So that sort of rusty, grinding, unpleasant, skin crawling kind of horror that was very popular in the late 90s, early 2000s, stuff like Pulse was a bit later, I suppose, but Audition, stuff like that, all the J-horror stuff. And then in a couple of years, obviously you had the popularity of franchises like Saw and Hostel. And the atmospherics on this album in particular sort of predate that. You listen to something like Tattered and Torn or all the atmospherics in Scissors or Diluted or even Prosthetics, and it totally it almost rhymes. They go together so well, and I think that's something that's often forgotten about this album as well.
Yeah, indeed, and I would definitely put this album as mainly one of my top 10 debuts of all time, mainly because for nostalgic reasons, and that this was a very big impact of a metal debut. It's just like with other debuts like Black Sabbath's first album that no one has expected to hear something like that album, and that's the same with this. And I will have to personally say that this album always is my main favorite in the band's discography, and besides Iowa, of course. But it's just the main attraction that this debut really holds to me.
And at the point you make about it being a debut only makes it more impressive, in my opinion. I mean, let's compare this to the other debut albums by classic metal bands. So, Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, Rock-a-Roller, Kill 'Em All, Show No Mercy, Killing Is My Business, Fistful of Metal, the debut Korn album, Burn My Eyes, the early Typo Negative stuff. Like, I'm not necessarily talking about the underground bands, but the major popular metal bands who have sort of gone down in commercial history. Do any of them have a debut album which comes roaring out of the traps quite as menacingly, quite as potently as the first Slipknot album? Now, you might say that about Kill 'Em All, and that would be a fair comparison. But you listen to this and you think, for a debut album, at least on a global scale, whether you consider Make Feed Kill Repeat an album, I suppose, is in the eye of the beholder. But the idea of a debut album opening with, the 7/4/16 intro into Sick, Eyeless, Wait and Bleed, Surfacing, and Spit It Out, all 5 of those songs have gone down into, metal legend. Like, whenever you see Slipknot live, you're going to hear at least 4 of them, often all 5. Both times I've seen Slipknot, I think they've played at least 4 of those songs. And they're all in a row. And I think that's why you often have this thing where people going, oh, it falls off a cliff afterwards. But you got to put yourself in that context. A debut album, their initial grandstanding on the global stage, and they come up with 5 songs which, if they never did anything else, they'd already be in the history books, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's always a very important thing to think about for debut albums, especially with metal entirely. So we're going to go into the entirety of the album very briefly, because we've almost talked about the album for almost 20 minutes, but we are going to talk about each track, musicianship wise and musically. So the album opens with 7426 17000027, which is less than a minute of some really eerie, noisy sounds, and the repeating sentence of the whole thing, I think it's Sick, which is just pretty much like a noisy industrial kind of introduction to me.
Yeah, I love this. I think it's a fantastic way to open the album, and the way they employ it live. Whenever they're about to play Sick, they let this play for a good minute or two, and the tension it builds is just excellent. In fact, I tried listening to this album without the intro track, because often people say, oh, intros, do you really need them? Pressing play and it going straight into Sick is obviously great, but with that extra minute just at the beginning to bleed into it, the rush it gives me is it never dulls, no matter how many times I listen to this album. One of my favorite intros or interludes ever.
Yeah, and that jumps right into Sick, which structure-wise, if you guys have seen my May Feed Kill Repeat demo review, I said that the structure of that track is very much alike to this, but Sick as a track, for the actual very first song musically, this is just adrenaline boosting up to the max, and you hear these crushing riffs and one of Joey's most creative, adventurous drumming, but just the intensity overall on this track was just non-stop brilliance. And hearing Corey's distorting vocals for the first time, he puts in so much of the action and very big mentality. And Sick as a song by itself at over 3 minutes, just as a monster of an opener.
Yeah, I mean, that drum pattern, that da 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 da. I mean, that's just, as far as opening statements go, that's up there with, that drum pattern is as recognizable as, the opening of Rain in Blood, or Run to the Hills, like any of these super well-known, super popular metal drum beats. And from there, I mean, this song, you can see why they landed themselves on Roadrunner. It really reminds me of both Sepultura and Fear Factory. Feels like a bit of an amalgam of those two, which obviously is no bad thing. But in 3 minutes, this song goes so many places. There's very little repetition. It keeps moving. And again, great use of samples with that Carlitos Way, Here Comes the Pain, before the scratching comes in. But yeah, 3 minutes and 12 seconds or something like that, and it just explosive. It never stops. It flies by. That crushing, lumbering, breakdown towards the end, where it breaks all the way down and then builds up and builds up and builds up again. Just glorious. Like, what a start. It again never gets old, never loses any of its potency. Just a masterwork for an opening track.
Absolutely a perfect track. So that leads into the DJ scratching, looping for the intro to the song of Eyeless, and hearing these very ear-aching, noisy notes from Mick, and again some thunderous drumming patterns from Joey. The whole madness of this track explodes and goes in multiple sections non-stop. Corey's vocals on this track were just at some of his most frantic, including his manic vocal performances with the chorus, including the reference of Marlon Brando onto You Can't See California Without Marlon Brando's Eyes, and then that eruption of a breakdown section. This is definitely one of the most punishing numbers out of the whole record, musically and musicianship-wise. I think that this is one of the tightest grooves than Sick. But as much as I love the previous track, I think Eyeless is more of a stronger track.
Oh, I fully agree all the way through that. I sometimes there's a few that are contenders, but I think this might be my favorite Slipknot song. I think in terms of what Slipknot do, this pretty much has everything, save for the melodic side. But the jungle beat at the beginning, Joey's performance. I mean, seeing as this series is a tribute to Joey, it'd be wrong not to mention his performance on this song in particular. Just, I don't know how many videos I've seen of him playing this song. It's endlessly enjoyable. It's just the way he throws fills in every tiny little space. It's just fantastic. And as you say, Corey's performance is great here as well, particularly frantic, as you say, in the chorus, almost channeling a bit of Jonathan Davis at that point. And yeah, the breakdown, just a riff that most bands would write a whole song around, and here they leave it till about 2 minutes in. And it's especially good when, in the last 25 seconds, they bring it in even slower. They play almost like an Electric Wizard riff. But yeah, no, just exceptional song. The energy, the way this Sick goes straight into this as well, it's almost like no time to lose energy. Just, it almost gets more and more intense with that shrieking guitar line as well.
Yeah, so Eyeless is always a live staple as well, because this was just like a world-shattering piece of music from a song like this. And after this track, we switch into one of the most iconic numbers of all time from the band, Wait and Bleed, which I think was one of the very first Slipknot songs that I was really getting into it. I do love the progressiveness onto the drumming patterns, but with the versatility of the riffs and the lyrics. I actually really like the different versions of the song. When you hear Corey's vocals, there were some versions of just hearing his cleans more, burying his screams, and the other one the opposite way round. But Wait and Bleed is just another staple for Slipknot. And come to think of it, since you'd mentioned the live music video of it, I believe that was the first live music video that I've seen from a Slipknot music video. But I'll never forget, with the animated version of Wait and Bleed, it used to freak the shit out of me because the way the guys were animated, and it was just one of the freakiest music videos ever. But anyways, the song is a classic, and I think this really just builds in so much more of the adventurous ways for building a craft on a song like this. So Wait and Bleed, just another masterpiece.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is really the song that, at least in this country, from what I've been told, sort of broke the ban. This video was getting a lot of airtime on MTV2, Kerrang TV, and that sort of thing. It's a fantastic song. I'd say in the scheme of the album, it's probably one of my lesser favorites. But even then, I mean, that's not really to say anything bad about the song, but rather the quality of the album at large. The again, another really inventive performance from Joey, particularly in the chorus, that tom work, and you know, this is considered one of the lighter songs on the album. But even then, the breakdown at the end is, you know, pure Sepultura worship. It's great.
Yeah, I do love how percussive the later tracks go as well, which we will talk about in a minute. So after Wait and Bleed, we go into the song of Surfacing. Again, just like Eyeless, hearing these noisy guitar notes and to hear Josh's backing opening guitar riffs, the anticipating percussion-driven build-up. And I'll have to say that out of all of the songs on this album is definitely very strong for what it is on most of these tracks, but Surfacing is the one song that is always my favorite. It's my favorite song on the record because this is just, I would say, like an early stage of Slipknot writing and making music as like the whole fuck you kind of thing, and especially onto that chorus. I really admired the bridge section, which sounds like a totally different song, but Surfacing, especially when they play it live, every time I see them do that song, it was just nothing but pure brilliance. And Surfacing to me is the highlight of the record.
I mean, I can't argue with that. Surfacing it's gone down in legend with Slipknot for a very good reason. There's a reason why they close essentially every show maybe they've ever played. I think there was a while where they were opening with it, which I don't know if it works so well as an opener, but there's a reason why almost every time you go see Slipknot, they're going to close with Surfacing. Just as you say, and with the chorus, the whole like fuck you attitude. Slipknot, especially on this album, I think, have a real talent for having lyrics which, if they were in the hands of another band, you might sort of roll your eyes or think, oh, that's quite cheesy, that's quite corny, that's quite juvenile. It's if someone like Hatebreed released this song, that's not anything to say anything bad about Hatebreed, but I'd find it a bit distracting. If Five Finger Death Punch, for example, released a song with these lyrics, you know, as I said, I'd be rolling my eyes, I'd be going, oh, geez, this is pretty childlike. But with the conviction and the musical backing behind it, I don't even question it. I hardly even notice. Yeah, it's another one of my favorites on the album, particularly, as you say, the bridge bit, which I think often gets overlooked. Just fantastic bass work from Paul, partnered with really inventive patterns from Joey, and Sid scratching, just adding to the frantic nature of it. Yeah, I mean, what's there to be said about Surfacing? It's just omnipresent in terms of its influence on 21st century metal.
Indeed, and we now go into another very popular song from the band, Spit It Out. And Spit It Out, from the demo version, I really like how raw it sounded, especially with the more distorting vocals from Corey. But the album version by itself, I think Corey's lyricisms and vocals were just chaotic, and some reason when it comes to the fast vocal performances, it does remind me on a little bit of Devin Townsend with Strapping Young Lad on songs like maybe Oh My Fucking God, for example, which really reminds me of that type of song. I adore Strapping Young Lad, but back to this song. Spit It Out, just another cracking number with just another really good catchy hook, and the whole Fuck Me Bridge section was always fun, especially when they do it live. But there's really not much that could be said about Spit It Out other than it's, to me, maybe one of those most common songs in the rap metal vein.
Yeah, you can. This is Slipknot having fun here, and this is possibly, I'm not sure, but it's maybe this or another one we'll speak about later. The point on the album where Slipknot most resemble their peers. This is probably the closest they get to stuff like Korn and Limp Bizkit and the metal bands who were really popular at that time, or new metal, I should say, more broadly, as you say, with the rapping and stuff. But with this song, it is under 3 minutes. It's got like these frantic, aggressive verses, a dub section in the middle, which builds to an eruption in the Fuck Me, I'm All Out of Enemies bridge. This is one of those songs where, as I say, in the hands of another band, this could not appeal to me whatsoever. But when Slipknot do it, it's a classic for a reason. It's fun. It's again, how much they can pack into 2.5 to 3 minutes is just remarkable, and this is one of the best examples of it.
Indeed, at that, just one of the best tracks on the record, just for the hyperness vibes of it. But then we go into one of the darkest tracks on the record, the heavily creepy and disturbing nature of this track, Tattered and Torn. By comparing it to the Mayfield Kill Repeat version, this one just takes up to another level. Joey's drumming patterns pretty much as diverse and same as the demo version, but with different lyrics written by Corey. This is just one of the most eerie sounding tracks. And this was still given the rights to Anders Kolsefny and Donnie Steele because they were involved from the writing process of this track. But when this lineup of Slipknot did this track, they just simply made it even more just dark all the way through.
Yeah, I think Tattered and Torn, it often gets a bad rap because, like I was saying earlier, the first 5 songs are just the stuff of legend now. And Tattered and Torn acting as almost as an interlude between that part of the album and the second part. I think some people see it as like, oh, this is when the album stops being as good, but I think it's a necessary part of the album. I think the way it's woven into the tapestry, it acts as a nice transition between. I feel like the first 5 songs are almost like being punched in the face, and from here on, it's almost like it's dragging you under. It's a slower, more patient, for the most part at least, more menacing album than it is an outright vicious one. And Tattered and Torn, again, the sound design is just remarkable. All the little like clings and clangs that you get in the headphones, just a really clever and inventive bit of songwriting and really intelligent album sequencing.
Perfect descriptions. To me, one of the most very underrated Slipknot tracks, especially onto the disturbing side. But that's not until we go into the 2 controversial pieces, according to the album release, original pressing wise of this album, of Frail Limb Nursery and Purity. So Frail Limb Nursery is just, I would say, a very scary opening intro to Purity. And Frail Limb Nursery, the voice sample was taken of Purity Night from crimescene.com. And as much as the album's opener, 742617, etc., is great, but I think Frail Limb Nursery, to begin the anticipating drum beat to Purity, which will go into Purity right after this track, I think this interlude is maybe the most unsettling one.
I would agree with that, and I'm really glad that we're doing this version of the album in this discussion, that we're including Frail Limb Nursery and Purity, because to be honest, in some versions this whole bit is replaced by Me Inside, which is one of the bonus tracks on the other versions, and we'll get to that song. But for me, Fralem Nursery and Purity are infinitely better. Purity is another one of the songs which I often consider as one of my favorite Slipknot songs, or as my favorite Slipknot song. It's like this, Eyeless, Disaster Piece, and The Blister Exists usually are the ones which sort of cycle. And I think this is a really important song in Slipknot's discography, and a lot of people maybe not overlook it, but I don't think people look at it in that way. I think much of that is because of the chorus. You see Corey's vocal melodic ability, which he shows a bit on stuff like Wait and Bleed and a bit in the chorus of Spit It Out. But this is the first bit where you go, okay, wow, this is a real talent for this style of hook writing. And then, again, in terms of great performances, the man of the match for this song, in my opinion, is Joey Jordison. That sort of semi-hip hop beat that opens the song, and then those sort of free-form jazzy verses, which just sound like stream of consciousness, like it's all coming off the top of off the top of his head. Those tasteful rolls and everything. It's just a masterpiece. This song, I absolutely adore it.
Yeah, Purity in terms of vocal delivery as well. This is easily one of Corey's most emotionally breaking and powerful sounding vocals, especially with the bridge sections and the haunting vocals on the chorus and the harmonies just chills, and especially with his about to voice breakage finalizing part of the song of screaming the track title is very intense. So these two tracks received a lot of controversy for Slipknot because when this album came out with these two tracks, they were sued, and Corey had to go through an experience of talking about the track. They went through court cases with these two tracks, and then eventually they had to be dropped. So with the very common re-release of this with the band name at the top, those two tracks were taken out, and that they were replaced with Me Inside after Tattered and Torn. But Purity as a song really adds in, I think, some of the best moments of the entire album, musicianship wise and for performances. So Purity really is one of the top three darkest Slipknot tracks. So after Purity, we switch to Liberate, the opening guitar riff from Mick Thompson, and again with Corey's brilliant vocal delivery. This is a song that crushes all the way through for 3 straight minutes. These pummeling, booming, percussive drumming patterns and the madness that this track surrounds is just really an unstoppable song. And I would have to say that sound-wise, it's, I would say, pretty much similar to the franticness of, if that's a word, the frantic side of Sick and I would say Tattered and Torn, but I think Liberate is another brilliant track.
Yeah, this is a song which, once again, in the hands of a lesser band, would not have the power that it does, because it's quite a basic song. The riff is fairly easy to play. The structure's not all over the place like some of the songs, particularly ones that we're going to get to. But as you said, just the conviction, the power of it, it's just excellent. And the build at the beginning into that, I don't know if it's Craig or if it's Sid at this point, that before the drums come in and it all explodes into the chorus. That just all the little tasteful little tidbits like that were just ear candy throughout this song. Yeah, another brilliant song.
I think when I've watched Disaster Pieces, I believe it was Sid that did the sampling noises before the explosion of mentality bursts in. But I think Liberate is a very underrated number at that. So after Liberate, we go into one of the other really dark songs on the record, similar vein as Tattered and Torn, which is Prosthetics. Prosthetics I think is very overlooked, and there's not many people that would go into this track very deeply. But just like Tattered and Torn, very disturbing and just an unsettling vibe. Hearing the clanging of the cans from the percussion and the rhythm side of it, and the turntables sampling really makes it just as, you know, unsettling to cope. But Corey's vocals on this one just go into a low vocal register, and then the volume switches from the darkness of the quiet volumes, and then the immediate action of boosting up the aggression. Is just a switchable track musically and instrumentation wise. This is, I think, one of those other destructive ones at that.
Yeah, this is another one of my favorites, right up there for me. And funnily enough, it wasn't for a long time. I never obviously disliked this song. It was always a great, valid piece of the album. But 2 years ago, it would have been, they played a Download Festival, and they played this, which I didn't look at the set lists beforehand. I wanted it all to be a surprise. And they went into Prosthetics. It was a real surprise. I went, oh, wow, they're playing this one. Because there were loads of songs which they didn't play that night. Even ones off this album, which you think would maybe get a better response from the fans than something like this. And yet, it just, under those conditions, the song just comes alive. And now, whenever I listen to it, I remember that moment. And again, to people who argue that Slipknot are a sort of kiddie band or maybe juvenile or more of a gateway band, and they, you know, that sort of criticism that you often hear with them, Prosthetics, it echoes stuff like Neurosis, Nine Inch Nails, Throbbing Gristle, you know, just horrible, clanging, grinding, you know, pounding music like that, Godflesh, all that stuff. And it's not the sort of stuff that you would imagine a new metal band would take that much influence from. Like, I couldn't even Korn on their first album wouldn't do something this menacing or extreme, in my opinion. Yeah, this is just an exceptional song, and it sort of sets you up nicely for the final run to the end, because it's just this slow, progressive, dizzying number, which, you know, really just it's just excellent. I love this song.
It's really funny that you mention about the industrial vein, like on Nine Inch Nails, because I would definitely, now that I've been digging deeper into Nine Inch Nails, I could definitely hear the resemblance on something very similar like this, or maybe on a Ministry number. But I think Prosthetics, you know, just like with Purity, this is another one where they can just go and explore, and there's just so much of the versatility, despite that some people say that the instrumentation on most tracks can be very similar towards each other. I mean, that's what new metal is for the most part. But I think for instrumental wise, for most tracks, Slipknot have not really begun their adventurous ways of finding different ways of writing music up until, I believe, Iowa and Volume 3. But I think Prosthetics is one of those examples of a song where I think that they do like to add in some diversity.
Absolutely. I really think that without this song, going from Liberate straight into No Life, or, well, the songs we're about to talk about, as great as those songs are, I think it would almost get a bit samey. I think putting something so different right here in the album, it just keeps it fresh, you know, keeps your mind interested. Just exceptional. One of my favorites.
Excellent number. So the next track, No Life. This is another one that's below 3 minutes. And again, with Corey's vocal passages, when he just goes in a spoken word feel, and then he just goes into this very anxiety-driven panic of verse deliveries, and the verse-wise hearing the interplay between the musicianship is just wonderful. I do love the chemistry with the combination on syncopating each other with the separate roles from each of the bandmates. Not really a percussive number in terms of the the percussion from Clown and Chris, but I think No Life is very underrated. For me, in terms of maybe my least favorite number on the record, No Life could possibly be the choice, but I still really dig this song.
Yeah, I think this is a great song too. I sort of see this and the next two songs as a bit of a suite in the album. I always sort of put them together. I very, very rarely would listen to just one of them. If I'm gonna, if I'm sort of just doing like shuffle with Slipknot songs, I'll often put these three on in a row because the tempos are slightly different. The tempos are fairly similar. They all have very sporadic structures and stuff. But to go in with this one, I think this is, again, like as you said, a really underrated song. I hear very few people talking about it. They almost never play it live, and the invention all over it, the great, I don't know if it counts as the chorus. I guess this would be the bridge, that melodic bit with the sort of backbeat percussion underneath it about halfway through the song is just, again, most bands, if you had that written, you'd base the whole song around it. Whereas there, it's just this throwaway 20-second thing in the middle of the song, and a song which very few people ever talk about. Again, fantastic use of sampling, and that's true particularly of this and the next for the last few songs and the end songs. And I think that's why, just to say what I was saying about the punch in the face followed by being dragged under, the first few songs, the hooks are very obvious, whereas for this run, they get under your skin, they worm your way into your head gradually.
Yeah, so I personally think that No Life deserves a lot more of the credit than it deserves. But I would definitely see that the first few tracks and onwards, they follow each other very, very massively. And there's barely anything that I would say as problematic. But for some tracks, No Life is one of the songs that I still really like. Not one of the standouts, but since that I do love this album, it still counts as, to me, a very, very good track. And I agree, one of the most underrated Slipknot songs. So, the third to last track of Diluted. Diluted is, to me, a very, very interesting track because I feel that this is where the interaction and connection of switching passages go into completion with this track, because this begins on another corker of a very simplistic riff, and then hearing these skillful snare drum patterns and the turntables and scratches all over, making it something similar to Tattered and Torn. But then the build up to the chorus was just, really non-stop intensifying. And I actually have noticed that the bridge section to this track, the band had done previously. Obviously, this was before this lineup came to be. The bridge section for Diluted is exactly the same as onto the demo of Interloper. And Back to Purity, actually, the track of Despise is very similar on the verse sections, and the whole thing in general. Despise is pretty much like a very early version of Purity. But anyway, Diluted, for me, is a really, really good number to finalize things on the whole album.
Yeah, again, another great song. In particular, I'd like to pay attention to the work of Craig Jones on this song. There's really clever uses of sampling in a song that's so frantic. And it very rarely sits in the same pocket for a while. Again, I guess this credit to Joey Jordison, just the way you can switch tempos with such ease. But his work on this song, I feel, almost grounds it while also adding to the frantic nature of it, which sounds like a bit of an oxymoron. It doesn't seem like those two things can be possible. But he just throws in all this stuff which just stays stuck in your head. Like, I can't remember what the films from some British horror film from the 80s, I think, but that I Haven't Got Time for the Living sample before the second verse kicks in is just tiny little stuff like that throughout this album. Just, it makes it so much more exciting. I've heard that this was quite a difficult song for Corey to write and record, and that is often given as an explanation of why they've never played it live. I suspect that that is part of it, but it's also just a really complex song for everyone involved. Like, no member of the band is, on easy street on that song. Everyone has to be active and so on and so forth. And yeah, just a really, really good song. For a while, it didn't entirely click with me. In fact, for a while, I considered it my least favorite song on the album. But now that's, certainly far from the case. This is, a very overlooked favorite of mine.
Yeah, same go with me. Just like No Life, there's barely a Slipknot fan that would really go into this track a lot more than the tracks previously, because the previous few opening songs on the album, they were like obviously the most iconic and beloved. But I think with some of the later half of this album, it does contain one of my favorite tracks in the underrated spectrum for Slipknot, and Diluted deserves more credit. So the second to last track, Only One, re-recorded, and again, this was given the writings to Josh Brainard, Anders Colsefni, Donnie Steele, etc. from the Mayfield Kill Repeat era. Only One, comparing this to the demo, this is the superior version. And I think that this is another one where everything just manically explodes for a lot of the diversity. And just like what I said about the fast rapping, like on Devin Townsend, Corey's vocals verse-wise on here is just absolutely outstanding. And I think Only One, with this type of production and sound, it sounds more dynamic. It sounds a much bigger form than the previous version. But Only One, especially with the different tempo changes and the bridge sections to the I guess the intermission part on the drum soloing, Only One is for me another one of the highlights on the record.
Yeah, this is sorry, my bad. This is another really good song. Again, 2 minutes 20, 2 minutes 30, another short one. Once again, so many ideas packed into such a tiny amount of time. I love the fact that it opens with that whirring from South of Heaven. I think that's just such an inventive, clever trick. And it's one of those things which, again, they would have had a lot of people doubting them at the time, seeing them as a gimmicky band. And yet, if you're in the know, if you recognize it, it's almost like a bit of a calling card. You're referencing Slayer at the end of your debut album. And one of the absolute best moments on the entire album is on this song, in my opinion, and it's that Only One of Us Walks Away hook at the end. It's just, it's hard as nails. It's just, there's not really that much to say about this song, to be honest. It's just a blur. It goes by so fast. There's so much stuff going on. As you say, Corey's rapping, like the riffs, which they'll just play twice and then throw away forever. And then just that gorgeous finale. Leading into the real finale, which is obviously what we're talking about next.
Indeed. So the final track and the longest number on the record, Scissors. And as I've mentioned earlier on in the video, that the band did make a song called Heartache and a Pair of Scissors, and they did perform that live. But when the band, at this point, I would say, decide to come back into a song like this, switching things around a little bit, especially with the multiple structure pieces connected to one another. Scissors, I think, is another one of my favorites on the record, and some people may give it a little bit of flack, saying that it may be a weaker finale closing track, but that's not actually the last ever song that we get to hear in terms of what's to come after this track. But Scissors, really disturbing lyrically, and the lower tuned guitar riffage, and especially Corey's vocals. He was going through a lot of emotions on here, just brings in so much of the non-stop aggressive and voice breaking mentality. This track, for me, is one of the strongest numbers on the record because it increases so much of the horrors and just the unnerving shock and terror that this track really brings to the table. Loads of guitar noises and feedback and berserk drumming on Joey's parts and the multiple bashful violent kicks. Everything about this track at 8 minutes, it is an all over the place number, but that's a part of its charm. And with a lot of these lyrics that Corey had been writing on this record, they were in different characters. Everything is just on hatred and the whole fuck everything, I hate myself, to a lot of these very grim, vile results of imageries that went into Corey's head, and especially with Scissors, this track for me amplifies, I think, one of the best crescendo finales to Slipknot's history, and for this to end the album not until the very last track that we go to in a minute. Scissors is one of my favorites on the record.
Fully agree with all of that. Absolutely. This is another one of my favorites on the album. As you say, a lot of people often dismiss this song. They think it's maybe misguided or poorly written. I actually think the sort of more atmospheric soundscape quality really suits Slipknot in this song. The rest of the album is packed with hooks. It's full of, choruses and, as I say, like ear candy stuff, which you can immediately lock onto and it's in your head forever. This is one of those songs which you never forget. And I feel like everyone remembers the first time that they heard it. That might sound dramatic, but I think it's true. But it's still it's that slow, groaning, menacing build over time from, the opening of that, almost a scraping sound with the keg hits and the bass coming in, just building and building and building, adding more and more stuff. You're hearing the layers added before your very eyes. And again, that huge crescendo, as you said. And I actually think this is a very clever crescendo. It's something that I don't think Slipknot get a lot of credit for. But you get the big crescendo at like 7.5 minutes in or something, and it sounds like it's over. And then almost like it's dying and it's got one last breath, one more last burst of energy. It almost comes back in again as if it's like clawing its way towards you. That all sounds quite pretentious, but I think it really adds to the excitement of the album, where just when you think it's over, it starts up again and then falls apart all over again. And I think this is one of those songs which, if the album was any shorter, it wouldn't really have worked. But because the album is, as I said, 60 minutes or however long it is without all the silence, I'm not sure. It really feels like you're drained and the album's, collapsing around itself. It's almost got too much. I'm trying to think what the word is here. It's almost like it's exhausted with rage. A favorite of mine. And it's a real shame that I understand why they don't play it live anymore, because it's quite long and a fairly deep cut nowadays. Like, I'm not sure if you had a casual Slipknot fan go into one of their shows, they'd be that thrilled if they cut, Left Behind and Duality in favor of it, for example. But nevertheless, it's always been a favorite of mine. And I think a lot of people seem to, when they think of Slipknot going long and expansive, they refer to the Iowa title track. And I think Scissors is a much stronger song. Not to be, I guess it's not really in any place right now to be comparing the two, but I think Scissors is a much more effective finale to this album.
Yes, and I still admire Scissors for what it is, because as much as we've talked about the entire album from the original version, Scissors has an identity on its own. And that's what I love about it, because it's just as a massive massacre of a song, and especially Corey shrieking to screaming and just go into like a mental breakdown into the track. But for music's sakes, it's just I wouldn't say progressive, but it's a very different number when you compare it to the previous ones.
Absolutely, 100%.
So, obviously, after Scissors, more than 5 minutes of silence and the conversation of the band, which was the strangest part out of the whole record. The whole recorded bunch of audio of the band. As I'm looking this up, they were just absolutely going, I would say, in a hysteric way, because they were going through laughter and watching a pornography film that involves the affection of feces. And I did not know that at the time that I was first hearing this album at 12 or 13, 12 years old. But that's by the by. So I would say it's just one of the most unusual hidden snippets. But we go into the actual final track, but we're going to talk about a few more after this. This actual final track of Eeyore. I think Eeyore is just another very brief but manic yet awesome closing track, especially with, again, onto the drumming from Joey. His drumming on this, just so creative, and the blast beats to the virtuoso diversity of the riffs, and Corey screaming, "I'm the great big mouth," which he eventually got the name of himself with that. But Eeyore is just like some of the other ones previously. It's a huge deconstruction and more of a hateful domination wall of sound, of just the intensity. This is another one of my favorites on the record, and just to hear the final touches with screaming, drumming mentality to guitar noises and chords. Eeyore is, for me, one of the best Slipknot finalizing tracks.
Yeah, it's that always throughout this I've mentioned that, oh, this is one of my favorite Slipknot songs. This is in the contention. This is in the contest. This is in the runner-up or whatever. Ever since it reoccurred to me about 10, 15 minutes ago, I've been kicking myself for not mentioning Eeyore, because that is top 3 of the album for me. It's so fucking good. It's like the speed, how ferocious it is, just all the little changes. It's just the fact this didn't make the final track listing is, on one hand, crazy, but I myself have actually tried to find a place for it, like moving it up on Spotify, trying to find it, where would I have put Eeyore, because one of my favorite songs they've ever done, and by any other rights it should be on the track listing, but it doesn't really fit anywhere sort of nicely. It's almost too much at any given point. It's a bit too fast to go near the beginning. It doesn't really fit near the end because you've got that sweet and so on and so forth. And just glorious. Like, love the lyrical sentiment, love the speed of it. It's this almost hardcore 2-step bit towards the end. Just, I fucking love this song. And also the whole thing about them watching the porno with the feces in it. That is something that I wish could make a comeback. Not porno with feces in it, but like where you'd listen to albums and you'd have little like conversations, hidden songs, that sort of thing. I don't know how you could do it in the streaming age. I'm not sure it would be possible, but this was a real common thing back in the day. Obviously, like Nirvana with Endless Nameless, 15 minutes after Something in the Way, or Daimon, the hidden song on Around the Fur by Deftones. And then again, more recently, Mastodon did it with Pendulous Skin, I believe. I'm not sure if I'm remembering that correctly, actually. But either way, there's a lot of like hidden stuff on albums where if you leave it running for 10 minutes, you get another song. And this is perhaps the best example of it. Maybe the Deftones one runs it close, but the fact that you can listen to an album as good as this and then 5 minutes later you get a song this good again is just so exciting. I've never seen them play it live, but I would jump at the chance. It's it's one of my favorites.
Yeah, I think Eeyore, in terms of the album originally, is just an amazing conclusion to finish off this album, just like what the album had presented from the beginning. I think Eeyore is one of the best Slipknot closing tracks, especially like Iowa and Solway Firth. But in terms of closing tracks, Eeyore has to be it for me. So that is that with the original track listing of the record. But we're going to talk about a few more tracks. The tracks with Me Inside, and get this. So with Me Inside, as I've mentioned, which ended up being included on the re-release of this album after Tattered and Torn, Me Inside as a song, I think this is a really, really good one because it really starts things immediately on the fast double bass pedaling. And again, with Corey's unsettling and yet just a brief set of spoken word in the verse sections, I think the structure is not really that changeable, but I do like it when Corey, I should have said this earlier actually, I actually like it when Corey switches into the cleans and switching back and forwards into his screams. But Me Inside, for me, instrumentally, it has a bit of a groove to it, and especially on the bridge section where the melody of Corey's vocals really does fit in. But I think Me Inside is very, very good. But in terms on some of the songs that I have loved, I personally wouldn't connect Me Inside as like another one of like the top 5 Slipknot tracks on here. But I actually still really enjoy this track.
Yeah, this song's good. This is almost without question my least favorite of all the songs that we're going to talk about today. It's not necessarily a bad song. It's just I don't think it does anything which is not done better on another song. Like I like the riff. I like the eccentricities and all that. But to me, I think swapping Purity out for this is a bit of an error. When we're going to get to the next bonus track. I understand why that wasn't on the album, but either way, I don't think that this song is really an essential Slipknot song. It's not bad. It's not bad at all. But and it's a good point you raise about him going back and forth between the harsh vocals and the cleans. I'm not saying he was the first person to do it. Of course, people have done it beforehand, but I do think that sort of trick was broadly popularized by Corey Taylor, and that has become such a common trick now to have become a trope. You think about like modern metalcore, we have like harsh vocals in the verses, clean singing in the chorus, and how many bands have done that? Killswitch Engage, all the bands they've influenced. A lot of the gent stuff does that. Bands like Periphery, I could go on and on and on about how many bands have utilized that trick. And I'm not saying Slipknot started that, like that would be foolish and to discredit a lot of bands who were doing it beforehand, but it possibly one of the more popular early examples. And yeah, this is, as far as bonus tracks go, it's hard to be too critical because it's not actually on the album. So clearly they didn't think it was too essential. But yeah, it's a cool song, but my least favorite of the 16 or so we're talking about today.
Yeah, so not much that we could really describe about Me Inside, but actually, the more I think about the name and the song in general, Me Inside, when I was really getting into Slipknot, I used to browse on the internet and look up just a lot of random stuff on Slipknot, from music videos to pictures, fan-made art. But I came across very weirdly like a fan-made animated cartoon style music video of a fan-made music video of Me Inside, and that always really hits home with me as to really see Slipknot in that cartoon style. But I actually don't know if that's still up on the websites anymore. But well, the internet, I mean. But yeah, Me Inside as a song, just not one of the staples or one of the highlights, but I actually still enjoy it. But we're going to go into maybe the final track that we're going to talk about. If not, maybe a few more things. But we're going to go into the shortest track on the whole album in terms of the bonus tracks of Get This. Get This is, to me, one of the top 10 best in the debut, and it's one of my favorite Slipknot songs of all time. You can just hear everybody just going into some maddening, very chaotic, and just a big fuck you atmosphere, because Corey's vocals, especially lyrics, it's just balls to the wall, straight to the point, like calling out everybody, every band from the whole world to get sucked in the nuts. And instrumentally it has a very good, like a bit of a speed thrashy kind of aesthetics, especially with the legato bits in the bridge. But this track, as very brief it is, I think it's just one of those very short but awesome, sweet numbers with what Slipknot are very capable of. And again, with the interaction between the main vocals and with backing vocals to just everything in between. Get This as a song, just, to me, one of the best Slipknot tracks ever written.
100% agree. I absolutely love this song. I think it's excellent. It is quite silly. Like, you look at the lyrics and it is like, it, as you said, calling everyone out, telling everyone to suck his nuts and stuff. It's like, really, man, that's how you're going to close things? But I mean, I think it's Henry Rollins who said, when deciding what to write lyrics about, you should follow the primal scream, whatever it is that stirs you. And you listen to this, and you can tell that Corey is genuinely sort of like feeling pissed off, confrontational, and bullish about this subject. And talking about the music, it's a great point you make about the sort of speed metal aspect. I always think that the main riff in the that da da na 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 na, that always reminds me of stuff like DRI and maybe even early Napalm Death, and certainly stuff like Suicidal Tendencies. And then again, the bridge you mentioned, that's like down, that thing. I mean, that's straight from fucking Blessed of the Sick or like Human by Death, that sort of thing. That is such a death metal-y little playful riff that they just chuck in and keep going. Yeah, I love this song. And the chant at the end, Get This or Die, so simple, so effective. In fact, as I mentioned, I've seen Slipknot twice, both times at Download. And the 2015 show was, it was good, but the 2019 one was far better. And they opened with People Equal Shit into Sick, and then they went into Get This. And I couldn't believe it, because I've never expected them to play it live, because it's obviously quite a rarity nowadays. And obviously on the album, it opens with Ross Robinson saying, give me a scream, Corey. And Corey lets rip, and then the riff kicks in. And obviously, like, Scream for me, Donington is such a trope in metal now. Everyone who plays Download says it. So he went up and said, he did some little speech and then went, do you want some more? Then give me a Scream, Download. And it didn't click with me that he was referencing Get This until I heard that, and then it all kicked in. And yeah, one of the greats. I mean, again, I understand why it's not on the album, because if it were on the album proper, it would be a bit, I guess, jarring lyrically. Because the album's got quite a unified theme, even if it explores it in different ways. It's a lot about, like, self-loathing, external hatred, rage, isolation, that sort of thing. And this song is just basically, sticking two fingers up at every other band around them. And I think actually, I mean, maybe this wasn't intentional, but I think it was actually quite a wise move of the band at the time, because nu metal is who they were closely being associated with on account of the look and some of their music. Nu metal was like, it's so close to jumping the shark, and then it seems to be like Papa Roach and lots of other bands who I know a lot of people who like them. I don't care for it, but it's certainly going to lose its sort of cool factor when you get towards like Chocolate Starfish and that sort of thing. So for Slipknot to put out a statement like that a year or two before nu metal sort of sours and begins to age badly, again, it's actually quite wise. It was quite smart of them to separate themselves from that, because then you get Iowa, which, I mean, I'm sure you're going to talk about. You're going to talk about it soon with whoever your next guest is. But regardless, that, yeah, exactly. Like, and the changes they made there, distancing themselves further. But yeah, just a great song. As you say, one of my absolute favorites of the band's entire back catalogue.
Indeed, and Get This just always gets the adrenaline going. And just like what I said about the fan-made animation of Me Inside, I found one from Get This as well, very weirdly enough. Huh. But needless to say, I believe this style of production, much credit to Ross Robinson, because I love his production that he had done with the first few Korn albums to Sepultura with Roots. And I mean, he definitely was one of my favorites in metal album production. But in my opinion, in terms of production, producers that Slipknot had worked with, I think Ross Robinson is the best man that they've worked with, because the drumming, the guitars, to the bass, the scratching, the turntables, the samples, the vocals, everything on this album, tone-wise, sounds polished and really big. And as I've said before, that it's like on a bit of a live feel, and I can see why that the interaction between him and the rest of the band got along very, very well, as Ross Robinson would then later on work with the band again to produce the Iowa album. But I absolutely love this style of production. So yeah, so after this album's release, as I've said, Josh decides to leave the band, and then we see photo shoots and live shows, press conferences of an unknown Jim Root, who would later on be with Slipknot for the very first time, and Iowa to be the very first album to have Jim credited as the second rhythm guitarist for Slipknot. But anyways, I could say a lot of things more about the album, but I believe for more than an hour long of talking about, I think, one of the greatest albums of all time in metal, and for me in music history. I know that's very biased for me to say that, because I've been a fan of Slipknot for more than 10 years, but this is to me the best metal debut of all time. And are there any other things that we could talk about more in this video?
Well, I think we've pretty much covered it all. I did want to say one more thing about Ross Robinson. As you so well put it, his production on this album is stellar, absolutely perfect for the style of music it is. It's grinding, it's callous, it's bleak, it feels alive. He really captures the energy of Slipknot at this time. And I actually see Slipknot as a bit of a transitional band for Ross Robinson, because I'm sure you'll be aware, but to anyone who's watching who's not really aware of his career, as you mentioned, he worked on the first couple of Korn albums. He did Roots by Sepultura. He did $3 Bill Mule by Limp Bizkit. He did the Deftones demo. He was quite entrenched in that nu metal thing. And post Slipknot, he would go on to work with a totally different style of music. He would start working with At the Drive-In and Glassjaw and the Blood Brothers, sort of screechy, high energy, emotional hardcore music, primarily, or screamo, or post-hardcore, or however you choose to categorize those bands. And I see Slipknot not necessarily as the middle ground between those two. I think they definitely lean more towards the Korns and the Sepulturas than they do the Blood Brothers and At the Drive-In. But I can see why doing this album might have informed his decision to then jump ship, because beyond this, it's like, well, this is the sort of zenith for this particular style of late 90s metal. Like, what more can be done? And he then moves into something different. And as you say, he does a fantastic job on this album. And like you said, one of the greatest metal debuts ever. I think it's the best debut album by any of the major metal bands. If we're not going to talk about, the underground artists or, the sort of below the surface stuff. If I'm comparing this to Metallica, Iron Maiden, Sabbath, Rammstein, I don't know, Korn, Avenged Sevenfold, like all the major headline and major festival style bands, and that's who we should be comparing Slipknot to, really. I don't think any of them have a debut album as good as this.
I absolutely agree 100%. And for the whole thing, for this review, for talking about this album for 80 plus minutes, this was definitely worth the treat and the effort, because that I have always loved this record, and I am very, very happy that we all go in depth by how much we admire this album. And this, to me, will always never change of reaction and emotions, because this debut Slipknot album never goes out of style and out of touch. Same thing with Iowa, because most Slipknot fans pick Iowa as their best. As much as I love that album, which I've played recently, actually, but it's always this album that's my favorite. So with that being said, the album rating that I am going to give this album is obviously, for me, a 10 out of 10. And if I have to pick the list of my 10 favorite debuts of all time, this album is no exception, and as one of my high favorites in music history. So that's all I would say on that album.
Perfect. Or the only thing I maybe want to say again is, as I've been sort of hinted at quite a lot throughout this review, Slipknot are often dismissed, despite their popularity, as a sort of juvenile gateway band for people to get into real metal. And to those people, I would recommend revisiting this album. I'm sure many people have, in light of recent events anyway, but I would say that going back to it, just try and take, it's very difficult to sort of imagine a world without Slipknot, but take it as it is, and sort of see how inventive and important they are to the tapestry of extreme metal. In fact, I made this point to someone recently. I'm not sure in the 21st century there's been a band more important to extreme metal than Slipknot. Now, they themselves are not an extreme metal band. They have hints of it, but not necessarily are they. They're not an outright extreme metal band. They're not a death metal band. They're not a black metal band. But the popularity and longevity of those subgenres, a lot of that comes down to the popularity of Slipknot. Like, how many people do you think heard this album or heard Iowa and went, wow, I want stuff like that, and then checked out, I don't know, Lamb of God, and then went on to check out Behemoth and Cannibal Corpse or Cradle of Filth, and then went further and further and further. Next thing you know, they're listening to like Fortress or Vlad Tepes or, Black Salice and all that stuff. Maybe not thousands of people, but a fair few of them. And the popularity of stuff like deathcore and metalcore and groove metal in the 21st century, I honestly think a lot of it can be put down to this album. And that is a legacy that I'm sure most bands would adore to have. So my sort of closing statement is it's a classic, and its importance cannot be overestimated.
And with that being said, and by the way, what would you personally rate this album?
I suppose that's two different things, because you could either rate it in the sense that what would I give it if I heard it in 1999, and what would I give it myself personally now? I don't know if it's a flawless album. There's probably stuff in it that's dated a bit. As I said, like I'm not a huge fan of Me Inside. Wait and Bleed and Liberate are very cool, but they're not perfect. You know, there's definitely dips and troughs in terms of the quality of the album, in my opinion. But for me personally, I'm going to give it a 10. There's nothing really quite like it. Its importance can't be overstated. I absolutely adore it. It's an album that I never tire of. In fact, when I first passed my driving test about like 3 or 4 years ago, it didn't have any Bluetooth in it, so I could only have CDs in the car. And this was one which it stayed in there for months, because every time it was, you know, and never got bored of it, and I never wanted to listen to anything else. It was just endlessly addictive, endlessly joyful. I'm rambling again now, but is it a perfect album? No, but for me personally, it's, you know, one of my favorites. It's one of the albums that means the most to me, so it's going to have to be a 10 from me.
That is a very good point about how would you rate albums from the time albums come out to where you are at now, which I never really think about that at all. But this album, the more we talk about this, our connection just never gets out of touch. So yeah, Slipknot's self-titled album, a very big, bold and relevant statement of modern metal, and that's all that we would like to say. I know this is a very long review. This is our longest review that we've ever done for the channel, and obviously the longest review that I've done than any of my reviews. But anyways, this was just brilliant, and once again, thank you very much, Elliot, for participating in this.
Absolute pleasure, my man. I'd love to do it again sometime, hopefully under more, you know, pleasant circumstances than paying tribute to a legend. But, you know, always a pleasure. And yeah, it has been quite long, but I think with an album like this, there's a lot to discuss. So yeah, thanks again.
For those that have discovered Elliot for the first time in this video, then I would recommend his channel. But with that being said, this was a lot of fun. So thank you guys for watching. And as always, I will keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.